Hello, I'm Malcolm Cox, and this is a little bit of Luke, part 4. We're looking at background to the Gospel of Luke and the themes within it. Today, the marginalised. Those whom society of today seemed to not care about or think were important, either to society or, frankly, to God. However, what Luke presents to us is a very different picture. Jesus is interested with those who are on the margins of society. A few examples to set the stage here. For example, sinners, just quote, sinners, those beyond the pale. Jesus seemed to go out of his way to interact with these sinners. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law in Luke 5 verse 30 complained to the disciples of Jesus, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" In other words, if you were really from God, you wouldn't associate with such people. Jesus said himself in Luke 5, "I have not come to call the righteous, so-called, but sinners to repentance," which of course really is all of us. In Luke 7, the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say, "Here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners." Jesus effectively accepted his own label here. In chapter 15, verse 1, the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. They knew that he cared about them. But the Pharisees and teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." They stood at a distance, but Jesus welcomed the tax collectors, the sinners, those who the religious of the day, the so-called righteous of the day, would shy away from. So, first of all, we see Luke wanting us to make sure that we see the same picture of Jesus that the witnesses of the day saw, that Jesus cared about sinners. Now, also centurions. We talked about this in the last episode, but in Luke 7, the centurion comes and wants his servant healed, and he has such great faith that he amazes Jesus. The centurion is painted in a very positive light, even though he's a Roman, part of the occupying forces. And then again at the end of the book of Luke, Luke 23, verse 47, the centurion is a witness to the death of Jesus. And it says that the centurion, seeing what had happened, in verse 47, praised God and said, "Surely this was a righteous man." A righteous man. So a centurion is not only one of greater faith than anybody in Israel, but he is also someone who acknowledges that Jesus was a righteous man. That's extraordinary, given the political sensibilities of the time. So Jesus cares about, God cares about these kinds of people. Then we have women as a general block. In that culture, that time, women were not regarded as reliable witnesses. They were on the margins of society. Men sort of, well, basically ran everything, or at least that's how it looked. But Luke goes out of his way to point out that women are so important in the plan of God. First of all, we have the long birth narratives of John the Baptist and Jesus himself. So much in chapter 1 about that, chapter 2. Then we have the woman that lived a sinful life that came to Jesus in Luke chapter 7. The Pharisee didn't want her there. Jesus really valued her as she poured perfume on his feet. And then in Luke 8, we have a whole lot of people following Jesus who've been cured of evil spirits and diseases, helping to support him out of their own means. What an extraordinary thing. The woman subject to bleeding in Luke chapter 8 is highlighted. Then again in chapter 10, Mary and Martha opening their home to him. Then again in verse 13, a woman crippled by a spirit for 18 years. He heals her, and on we go. I mean, there are so many examples, we can't mention them all. Perhaps I'll add some references to this recording. Gosh, there's just so many. He really wants us to know that women are someone, or people, Jesus and God cares about the women. And then, perhaps most interestingly of all, the Samaritans. The Samaritans are highlighted. They were certainly on the margins, and in fact they were hated at that point by the Israelites, and I think the sentiment was mutual. However, we see that when they go to a Samaritan village in Luke chapter 9, the Samaritans don't accept Jesus, and John and James want to call down fire. Jesus says no. Just right after that, Jesus doesn't take it personally, because in Luke 10, the next chapter, he uses a Samaritan as the hero of one of the most famous of his parables, what's called the Good Samaritan. And so Jesus is showing us that even though at that point they rejected him, he still considered them someone to be valued and cared about. And then we find that there's the people who come to him with leprosy. He heals them, and who's the only one that comes back? The only one that comes back to thank him is verse 16. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner? Again, we see Luke making sure that we get the same picture of Jesus that was there, that he cared about the marginalized and those that it was thought that God was not particularly interested in. Again, the question perhaps for us today is, who are the marginalized in our society? Who are the marginalized in our minds that we might not care about as much as God does, as Jesus does? Let's think about that for ourselves. And if you've got any thoughts on what that means for you, please let me know. You can email me on mccx@mac.com, or you can leave a message anywhere you see or hear this recording. Until the next time when we get a little bit more of Luke, I hope you have a wonderful day and God bless.